You may have noticed that I'm sitting on an armchair without any arms. That's essential. The aim is to create a really wide berth around you because you can see how long these needles are. I use a needle which is 50 mils in diameter, so it requires quite a big grasp. They're also 110 centimetres long. I prefer using a really long needle because it supports the weight of the work evenly across the needle. It also helps me to turn the work after I've finished every row, especially as the work grows longer. It's really good too if you're working with the unspun wool. Because it's so fragile, you don't want tension on any particular point of the wool or the fibre because it will break easily. So you can see that my seating position is not particularly elegant, and so I recommend that you wear pants if you're going to be in company. Choose a place in your home that doesn't have anything around it. This is my living room. I don't have a lot of space. I make do with what I have, but I certainly make sure before I start the process that I have everything I need at my fingertips, so I'm not having to get up and down all the time. Extreme knitting is a really physical form of exercise. It's quite a workout. These days I've got great biceps, but it doesn't do anything for your triceps, so you're still going to have your tuck shop arms. Sorry, I'm working on that. So, you are going to need to use your whole body to knit this throw. I recommend you take regular breaks when you're knitting, especially a really large scale project. You need to keep your posture in check at all times. Make sure your back is really straight. Give your hands a rest. I tend to work in 20-minute spurts before I'll put my work down and go and do something else before I return to it. As a guide, a throw this size using a 5 kilo bump will take about 4 hours, or in my language, about 2 movies on Apple TV. That should do it. Okay, so get comfortable. Get your armless chair, sorry. You can also sit on the floor if you prefer. I tend to stick to the chair because from the floor at my age, it's a long way up. I like the chair too because as the work gets bigger, you're going to have to stand up to turn the row, and it's so much easier from a seated position. On the floor too, if you're not standing up to turn every row, you'll find that your throw will twist and it becomes or feels a bit like a dead weight. And it also creates a bit of a tension between the blanket and the stitches on your needles, which I find not comfortable at all. But it's highly doable on the floor. I sit cross-legged. I use, again, my legs to support the weight of the needles and the work. It's as comfortable really in that regard. But you can see before I start knitting, I just want you to really take in this seating position. You can see I'm holding the needles really close to the ends, not unlike the oars of a rowing boat really. And it's my legs that's supporting the weight of the needles, not my arms. I'm purely using my arms to lever the sticks, essentially. And as we go on, you'll notice too that I will use my fingers quite intricately to manipulate the stitches and help them feed onto the various needles. But that's for later. So, to start off, just like normal knitting, we're going to do a slip knot. I'm going to show you a really basic cast on. It's a bit like a cable cast on. It's the cast on my mum taught me, and honestly, it is the only cast on I know. And so I stick to it. I like it though because it has an elasticity to it, which is important when you're working on this scale. The biggest killer of joy when it comes to extreme knitting is working with a really tight tension. Avoid it at all cost because you'll just make your life a misery. You'll really be fighting the yarn and the needles, and it's not fun at that point because it's physical enough without you throwing an extra hurdle into the works. So I'll do that again, sorry. You've got your tail, your long end, create your little loop, pull up. I'll do it again. In through the middle, pull up. Now you can see that's a pretty big loop, and I'm not going to tighten it yet at this point. I will wait till I put the needles through to adjust it correctly. To cast on, I stand one of my needles in an upright position. I just find it easier, and I actually use my legs to help support it. So this is when I'll tighten my slip knot. So I just pull down slightly. Again, I do not make my cast on firm at all. The aim is to resist any resist between the needle and the yarn itself. If I really tighten it up, which is, I know, the norm for proper knitting, as I call it, you know, it's going to be a struggle when it comes to creating your subsequent rows. So just loosen it up. I generally, as a guide, that's a bit too tight for me, fit 2 fingers in between the knot and that bottom needle. So to cast on, I'm going to cast on 24 stitches, and that will give me a throw which will end up being about 130 centimetres wide and 170 long. That's using a regular knitter's tension. I usually use a really loose knitting tension. I make sure every stitch is consistent though, but that's a little tricky to manage when you're first starting out. It's going to be enough for you to get used to the physicality. That's all you need to worry about to begin with. And as I said earlier, this yarn can be reworked over and over again and it will still look really beautiful. So don't be afraid of undoing your work to redo to ensure you get the result you want. So let's start this process. I put my needle through the stitches. I adjust my tension at this point. You notice I am not holding onto my yarn at all, only to adjust my tension. I am using my leg to support this needle. I'm actually barely touching it, and that's critical to my comfort level. It becomes very clunky if you're doing this, holding it up and not using your leg to rest it, you're going to get tired really quickly. Okay, so needle through, yarn over. See how I'm using my fingers to help keep that stitch in place. I'm pulling out, half a twist, back on. Adjust my tension. And again, you can see that I'm using my hand and my fingers to actually support this needle with my leg doing the rest. Yarn over, pull through, a bit of a twist and on. Adjust my tension. The more practiced you are, obviously the faster you will become. All knitting has a beautiful ritual to it. There's a lovely rhythm that develops between the eye and the hands, and I think all knitters would confess to the heart as well. It's a beautiful meditation, and the click-clack of the needles is just fab. Actually, one thing I forgot to mention before we started is that the bumps of yarn are wound quite tightly to try and minimise bulk for shipping purposes. There's over 200 metres of yarn in this particular bump, so that's a lot of wool. So as a result, in the winding process, the yarn can flatten a little bit, particularly towards the centre of the cone, the internal cone. So what I actually do before I start knitting is to unwind the bump as much as I can. Sometimes I'll just do the whole lot and I'll just leave it or I'll put it in a bag or cover it up in a sheet, leave it overnight. But if I'm not that organised, and often I'm not, I will at least unwind it in sort of big sections, let it recover, and recover it will. The yarn is about 20 millimetres in diameter, and that will become fully restored as time goes on, and even as you knit, that recovery process will continue. But if you give it a chance to recover on its own before you knit, that's good. I highly recommend that. I also recommend that you keep an eye on how much wool you've got already unwound from the bump, because you don't want to have to keep tugging at the bump as you knit. Again, the tension will become annoying. So at various intervals, I will stop my work and I'll just unwind a whole heap to start the process again. In this tutorial, I'm just going to knit with a garter stitch. I know that's the easiest of knit stitches to use, but I actually also think it's one of the most beautiful, and it's also one of the more difficult ones to get right every single time. You really need to be conscious of your consistency and your tension, that's for sure. But on this scale, the stitch looks incredible, and it just conjures up all kinds of different beautiful notions of comfort. All right, I'm just going to pretend that's 24. So to start your first row, we're going to change our needle position. So at this point, I'm going to drag my cast on row up to the front of the needles. I'm getting my working needle, which is my right hand needle. I'm placing it at the front of the stitch on my cast on side, and it's at this point that I'm going to adjust my tension. Then I'm going to place the yarn under and over. Again, please note my little finger position, they're always working. So nothing else is really controlling this needle at this point. So I'm placing my fingers on this piece of yarn, helping it come through and then off. Now I'm still not holding onto this piece to adjust my tension. I'm sure lots of people have got different ways of doing this, but this is what I've learnt to do to ensure consistency in my stitches. So I'm putting my working needle again through the front of the next stitch. It's at this point that I will adjust my tension. Now to create a regular knitter's tension, I'm going to pull down on this yarn, pull up slightly, but this is not tight and it's not even firm. It's a very gentle tension actually. Let it go, use my fingers and pull off. So front of the stitch, adjust my tension, let it go, pull down. So again, front of the stitch, adjust my tension. If there is any resist between the needle and the yarn, you are doing it too tightly. And I'll just do a quick demonstration of what happens when you hold onto the yarn as you would with proper knitting. I'm not particularly good at it actually because I'm out of practice, but if you can imagine this is normal knitting yarn and you're holding on to the yarn to control its tension, this is what's going to happen. So I've got a fairly firm hold of this now. So I'm going to wrap it around. Look, I've created resist and I'm all of a sudden fighting with myself. I can't pull back this needle easily now at all, and I'm causing this stitch to really stretch out in order for me to get that back and over. I'll show you again. So that's firm, really firm now. Pulling it back. And it's horrible and it's not fun. Don't do it. Ugh. I'm exhausted already. All right, I'm going to go back to my way now. I know it's a bit of a head spin at first, but I've taught quite a few beautiful knitters how to make this adjustment now, and once you get the swing of it, it will become second nature, I promise. And you'll be able to be a lot faster with your motions if you just give up on that desire to control the tension. You can be beautiful and consistent with your stitches by adjusting it just at this point. And so all we need to do is continue knitting until the yarn is used up.